This video demonstrates how you can take a structured approach to scrutinizing published research papers as a means of understanding the style and conventions of a particular journal that you are interested in. So, to get started, focus on a journal that interests you, a journal that you could see yourself publishing in, and then select and download 2 to 3 papers from that journal. It is important that you scrutinize more than one published works from the same journal, because your purpose here is to decode the style and how academic conventions unfold in the journal so that you can draft your first manuscript in line with your observations. Start with the introduction, and I'm tempted to say here this is the most significant section to scrutinize because research papers are often mapped on the introduction, so the central premise is there, the setup of the research gap should be there, we get an indication as to how the authors have framed their contribution, so scrutinizing the introduction is a very good place to start. Your task is quite simple. Read on a paragraph by paragraph basis. Then, next to each paragraph, make a note to yourself. What purpose does each paragraph serve? What do the papers have in common? So, for example, what elements appear in all the introduction sections in this journal? It is common for introduction sections to follow an hourglass anatomy, so spend some time tracing the hourglass in the papers in front of you. Broadly speaking, an hourglass structure means that the authors are moving from the broad to the narrow and then back again to the broad. In practice, this means that authors tend to start from a setup that includes context and background to the research topic, followed by some kind of confrontation or hook for the reader, which is essentially the research gap and justifies why the paper was written in the first place. In other words, this is the classic broad, here is what we already know about this problem, followed by a more narrow overview of what it is we don't know and that the paper will address. The lower part of the hourglass starts with a resolution. In other words, an overview of what the authors did and what they found, so an overview of the methodology and the key findings, gradually broadening again to provide an epilogue which tends to comprise of contribution and implications. So, how are all the things the authors found or shown in this paper broadly relevant? In the Bristol Doctoral College Sharepoint, you can access written guidance that follows this 4-step process for writing an introduction, so the setup, the confrontation, the resolution, and the epilogue, with more detail on what you might include in each section. Some of you might have noticed that this sequence is actually very similar to the structure of an abstract, and indeed it is, but there is one key difference. An abstract tends to place equal weight on the 4 stages of the sequence, whereas the introduction will be top-heavy, placing more emphasis on the background and confrontation, and less on the lower half of the hourglass. In the Bristol Doctoral College Sharepoint, you can also access a separate handout with so-called argument structure options. Argument structure is a different art to content structure, so up until now I have been discussing the possible flow of the introduction content. By contrast, argument structure refers to the rhetorical work you will be doing in your introduction and the logic by which you will organize your argument and particularly your setup and your confrontation. I recommend that you read through the handout and then see if you can identify what argument structure best describes the papers you are scrutinizing, and subsequently, what argument structure may best be suited to your own work. Keep in mind that not all options will suit you, and some disciplines lend themselves better to certain argument structures than others. Moving on to the latter end of your papers, depending on your discipline, some papers will finish with a discussion section, some will finish with a conclusion only, the latter being more common in the arts, for example, while some papers will have both. Scrutinize it, repeating the same key steps as with the introduction. So read through each paragraph and make a note as to what purpose does it serve and what are some common elements present in all the papers you have in front of you. It is not as easy to trace a common content structure in the discussion or conclusion section of papers in the same way we did with introduction. So a discussion section, for example, can be used by the author to introduce new points and insights and to show how findings relate to the broader issues at hand. Some disciplines may use the discussion to offer further interpretation of the data, while others offer a general conclusion that echoes what has been done without adding any new ideas. Here are some more specific ideas of what each section can include. So for the discussion, you can remind the reader of the research question, you can provide a synthesis of the results, you can contextualize the results in relation to the literature, and you can present the answer to the research question, showing how you contribute to solving the problem that you set up front. You may also ask more questions, pointing to limitations and providing directions for future research. For the conclusion, you can remind the reader why the article was written in the first place. You can expand the argument without repeating it, and you can deal with the so what and now what questions, so the conclusion can be another home to host directions for future research. In terms of broad content structure, in the same way as we used the hourglass to discuss the introduction, it might be useful for you to try and figure out if your papers are using a pyramid or reverse pyramid flow to wrap up the paper in the discussion or conclusion. So in the case of a pyramid structure, the authors will start by reminding the reader their specific knowledge gap and research questions they embarked upon, grouping the key findings to make certain arguments, summing up the evidence to arrive at final conclusions, and finally recapping the significance of the work. The pyramid structure then mirrors the overall flow of the paper. By contrast, a reverse pyramid flips that structure. The idea here is that the reader has waited long enough, and so now you need to tell them straight away what the key points are. You may still start by recapping the research questions, but this is immediately followed by the main results. You then elaborate on different arguments and findings, often in order of decreasing importance, finally recapping the significance of the work. Whether the papers follow a pyramid or reverse pyramid flow, notice how authors do not merely repeat results in this section. Instead, they may synthesize results to a level of abstraction so that they can be linked to broader issues at hand. So here we see bigger ideas developing rather than the nitty-gritty findings presentation that we tend to see in the analysis section.